I was still holding the rent
Did
envelope when she said it.
did you see this
Nobody
letter that
needs to
came?
know about this.
No,
It
what's it
wasn't whispered
about?
like a secret, not
Is it
really. It was
important?
the way someone might say, "It's fine," after you've spilled something, calm, dismissive, but with a weight underneath that doesn't match the words. I'd been living in the upstairs unit for 2 months. A studio over a converted garage, drafty in the mornings, walls thin enough to catch the rhythm of her blender at dawn. She was my landlady, mid-40s, divorced, a name on the lease and a steady kind of presence on the other side of the driveway. Not friendly, not cold. The kind of woman who seemed to have her life stacked neatly on invisible shelves. I'd knocked because the faucet wouldn't stop dripping. Started as a single drop, then a steady tap that kept me awake, so I figured I'd ask. She answered in jeans and a black sweater, sleeves pushed up, a faint streak of flour on her wrist like she'd been baking or fixing something herself. "Let me see," she said, brushing past me like it was no big deal. I followed her back up, awkward about how close we were on the narrow stairs. She worked quietly, tightening something under the sink. I stood there, useless, watching her hands move with a kind of certainty that felt out of place in that small kitchen. Most people fumble through plumbing. She didn't. "You didn't call a plumber?" I asked, mostly to fill the silence. She made a sound, half a laugh, half a sigh. "I'm capable of handling a leak. I don't like waiting around for people to do what I can do faster." Confident, not boastful, just settled. When the faucet finally gave a resigned cough and stopped, she sat back on her heels, wiped her hands on a rag she'd brought with her. Then she noticed the envelope I was still holding. "What's that?" "Rent," I said, holding it out. She didn't take it right away. Instead, she looked at me, like she was reading something between the lines of my face. Then, very quietly, she said, "Nobody needs to know about this." I froze. About what? The envelope? The fact that she came up here to fix something herself? But the way she said it, there was a tilt in her voice, a pause where my name should have gone, like a door cracked open just enough for a draft to get through. I handed her the envelope. She finally took it, fingers grazing mine by accident, or maybe not, I couldn't tell. It wasn't a spark, not yet, just warmth, a reminder that we were both alive, breathing the same thin air in that quiet kitchen. She stood, brushed invisible dust off her jeans. "You're all set," she said, already turning toward the door. No goodbye, no lingering glance. Just the sound of her boots on the stairs, steady, unbothered. But when the door shut behind her, the apartment felt different, like the walls had absorbed something. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the faucet's sudden silence. My fingers still felt the echo of her touch. Ridiculous, I know, but it wouldn't fade. That night, I kept replaying her voice in my head, like I missed something, or maybe wanted something. "Here's part 2, following the tone and progression you asked for," she called the next afternoon. Not a text, not a note on the door, a call. "Do you know how to move furniture without wrecking a wall?" I laughed before I could stop myself. "I can try." 10 minutes later, I was standing in her living room. It smelled faintly like lemon polish and coffee that had gone cold. Boxes lined the wall. Books mostly, stacked with that half-finished kind of order that says, "I meant to do this earlier but life kept happening." She pointed at a heavy oak dresser against the wrong wall. Too heavy for me to manage alone. We worked in quiet bursts, lifting, angling, pausing to breathe. She gave instructions, precise but soft, like she was used to doing things alone and felt strange asking for help. I noticed her hands when we stopped for a break. Not delicate, not rough either, just capable. A faint nick near her thumb, the kind you get from slipping with a kitchen knife or an old cardboard edge. "You okay?" I asked, nodding at it. She glanced at her hand like she'd forgotten it was there. "Fine," she said, tucking it into her pocket. "Just clumsy." The word didn't fit her. She didn't move like someone who was clumsy. We kept working, shuffling the dresser into its new spot. She gave a small laugh when one drawer slid out and landed on my foot. Not loud, just a quiet, involuntary sound that felt warmer than the coffee-scented room. I caught her rubbing her temple as she leaned against the wall. "Tired?" I asked. "Long week," she said, then corrected herself. "Long few years." It slipped out like it hadn't meant to. She straightened a second later, shoulders squared, face smoothing over the crack. "Anyway, thank you for helping. You didn't have to." "I wanted to," I said before thinking. Her eyes flicked to mine. Not long, not lingering, but enough that something shifted. We stood there, the dresser finally in place, neither of us moving to leave. She crossed her arms, not defensive, more like holding something in. Her lips parted like she might speak, then pressed together again. I wanted to ask about the long years, about the exhaustion in her voice, about why she lived with so many boxes stacked neatly but unopened. But I didn't. Instead, we stood there in a quiet that carried weight. She looked at me like she wanted to say something, but didn't, and that silence felt louder than words. It rained hard that night. Not the gentle kind that makes everything smell new, but the kind that turns the streets into mirrors and fills the air with a low, steady roar. The power flickered in my place twice, then went out completely. A fuse somewhere, maybe, or just bad wiring. I grabbed a hoodie, thinking I'd find a candle in the garage, but before I could look, there was a knock on my door. She stood there, damp around the edges, a flashlight in one hand. "Your power's out too?" she asked, voice louder than usual, fighting the sound of rain. "Yeah. I've got a generator downstairs. Stubborn, but it works. If you want some light, come by. I was just making tea." I followed her through the wet driveway, the rain soaking into my cuffs, the smell of wet asphalt hanging heavy. Her kitchen was warm, quiet except for the generator's dull hum somewhere below. A single lamp cast a circle of soft yellow on the table. She handed me a mug. Chamomile. Steam curled between us, making everything feel closer than it should have. We sat without talking for a while. She rubbed at a spot on the table with her thumb like she was erasing a thought. "Do you ever feel," she said finally, "like you're standing still while everyone else is moving?" I looked at her, but she didn't look back. Her eyes were somewhere near the window, watching rain streak down the glass. "All the time," I said. She gave the smallest nod, like I'd answered a question she hadn't quite asked. Then her phone buzzed on the counter. She got up, glanced at the screen, and for a second her face did something I hadn't seen before. A flicker, a soft twist, like grief showing its teeth. "Sorry," she murmured, silencing it, turning the phone face down. "You don't have to," I started. "It's fine," she said too quickly. Then quieter, "It's just him. He forgets he's not supposed to call anymore." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. The rain kept drumming. The tea cooled between my palms. When she sat back down, we were closer somehow. Not by much, just a few inches less of safe space between us. I could smell her shampoo, something clean, a little citrus. We talked then, not about the call, not about us, just about the rain, the power, the boxes she still hadn't unpacked. But her voice got softer as the storm got louder, and at one point she laughed. A small, tired sound, and her hand rested on the table, open, not reaching, just there. I don't know if I moved first or just thought I did, but my hand was halfway to hers when she said, "You should go now." And I did. But only my body left that room. The rain finally stopped 2 days later. The air smelled clean but unsettled, like something had been scrubbed away too fast. I hadn't seen her since the night in the kitchen. I told myself that was normal. She had her life, I had mine. Landlords don't check in on tenants unless they have to. But when she knocked that evening, I didn't believe my own story anymore. She stood in the doorway, not wet this time, but with that same look, like she'd been somewhere else entirely and hadn't decided whether to come back. Fuses, she said. Thought I'd check, just to be sure. I moved aside. She stepped in. We didn't talk while she flipped open the breaker box near the bathroom. No small jokes, no polite smiles. Just the sound of her boots against the tile. The snap of switches, silence filling all the spaces left empty by words. When she finished, she leaned against the counter like she needed a second. I stood across the room, arms folded, heart making too much noise in the quiet. Finally, I said, "We can't keep, whatever this is. We can't keep standing in kitchens like strangers who aren't strangers." She didn't look up right away. She just rubbed the side of her neck like it hurt. "What are we doing?" I said, softer this time. That made her meet my eyes. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She crossed her arms, then let them fall. It was like watching someone try to carry too much and finally set it down, not because it was heavy, but because it never belonged to them in the first place. "I don't know," she said. The words were low, raw, like they'd been waiting in her throat too long. "I don't know how this happened. I didn't mean for it to." I wanted to say I hadn't either, but that would have been a lie. I'd been thinking about her since the first night, since the envelope, since the way her fingers had brushed mine like it wasn't an accident. She took a step closer, then stopped halfway, like there was a line neither of us could see but both of us felt. "I can't," she started, then let the rest fall into the space between us. I didn't reach for her. I didn't move. The whole apartment felt too still, like a soundproof room in the middle of a city. My breath felt loud. Her eyes, they didn't move, just stayed locked on mine, as if that alone might answer the question neither of us had the courage to finish. She didn't say anything, just looked at me, like she was already mourning something we never even had. Here's part 5, carrying that slow, quiet burn into a twist. Nothing loud, but something that shifts the ground under their feet. It was late again, not storming this time, just quiet. The kind of quiet where you hear the clock more than you want to. I was halfway through a bowl of noodles when my phone buzzed. A message. "Can you come down for a minute?" No reason, no urgency in the words, but something in me didn't even think twice. She was standing in the doorway when I got there, not in her usual calm, composed way. Her hair was pulled back, too quick, uneven. She had her phone in one hand like it had just said something cruel. She started, then stopped, then opened the door wider. Inside, the house was darker than usual. Only the light over the stove was on. A glass of wine sat half-drunk on the counter. She handed me her phone. I didn't take it right away. "Please," she said, barely above a whisper. I looked. A voicemail. A man's voice. Older. Tired. Regretful. Not angry, worse. Careful. He said her name the way people say names when they've used them too many times in too many fights. "I saw the papers," he said. "You didn't have to file like that. We could have talked." I don't know what I'm saying anymore. I keep thinking about that summer in Portland. About the baby. About what we thought our lives were going to be. I can't stop. I don't know how to let you go. The message ended. I didn't know where to look. At her? At the floor? At the years that had just walked into the room like they'd been here all along? She leaned against the counter, head bowed, eyes closed like she'd been bracing for a storm that hadn't come but left wreckage anyway. "I was 23, she said quietly. "We thought we had time. We didn't. It wasn't a miscarriage. It was a decision. I don't regret it. I regret everything after." Her voice cracked, but just once, like a beam under pressure giving a single warning sound. He kept loving me like I was the same person. I wasn't. I kept pretending like I was. We killed everything trying to keep something alive. I stood there, hands in my pockets, useless, burning with the need to fix something that couldn't be fixed. "You remind me of him," she said then, looking up finally. "Not in the way you think. In the way you listen. In the way you stay even when you shouldn't." The room felt smaller, like the truth had stolen all the air. She took a breath like she hadn't allowed herself to in years. And for the first time, she looked at me without fear. We didn't talk for a few days. Not out of anger. More like the air had grown too heavy to push words through. I'd hear her footsteps in the driveway, the sound of her key in the lock, and I'd pause. Whatever I was doing like that would somehow steady me. On the fourth night, she knocked again. No pretext. No repair, no fuse, no rainstorm. Just her, leaning lightly against the doorframe like she wasn't sure if she should even be there. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. She sat at the small table, hands folded, eyes tracing the grain of the wood. I stayed standing. Neither of us wanted to be the first to break whatever fragile truce we'd made with silence. Finally, she said, "I don't want you thinking I've been honest with you. I haven't. I've been careful. That's not the same." I pulled out the chair across from her, sat down. The clock ticked in the corner. "I wasn't looking for this," she said, still not looking at me. "I was looking for quiet, for some corner of my life that wasn't tangled. And then you moved in. You were kind. You were easy to be around. I told myself it was nothing, that it had to be nothing." Her thumb kept rubbing the side of her index finger like she was working and not out of herself. "And now?" I asked, my voice lower than I meant it to be. She gave a breathy, almost laugh. "Now it's not nothing. And that scares me more than anything has in a long time." We sat there, not moving, the words hanging between us like wet clothes refusing to dry. I reached across the table, slow enough for her to pull away if she wanted. I just rested my hand, palm up, near hers. Not touching, just offering. For a long second, she stared at it, then at me, then back again. Then she placed her hand over mine, not gripping, just resting, warm, human, deliberate. No words followed. No kiss. No grand confession. Just the quiet click of something unspoken finally finding its shape. We stayed like that for a while, the fridge humming, the outside world carrying on without us. Eventually, she leaned forward, her forehead just barely touching mine, eyes closed, breath shaking once before settling. She didn't say she loved me, but she let her guard down. And that was louder than any "I love you" ever could be. It's been 6 months. That sounds short, I know. But when you measure time by the things that shift quietly in your chest instead of by the calendar, it feels longer. I still live upstairs. The faucet hasn't leaked since she fixed it. We don't hide, not because we're reckless, just because neither of us is pretending anymore. There's a difference. Some nights we talk until the sky starts to pale. Not about us, not directly, but about the shape of a life when you stop trying to force it into someone else's mold. She tells me about her years with him, how parts of her went quiet long before she noticed. I tell her about the years I thought I was supposed to be someone confident, loud, unshakable, only to find that quiet care is harder, braver. It's not easy. There's a gravity in what we share, not heavy in a bad way, just present. Pulls me toward honesty even when I'd rather hide behind a joke. It makes her let go of control in places she never thought she could. We still don't say big words. No declarations. No perfect lines for a postcard or a song. What we have doesn't live in those spaces. It lives in the way she presses her thumb against my wrist when she's thinking, in the way I leave her kitchen light on when I know she'll come home late. I've learned that love, if that's what this is, and I think maybe it is, doesn't always arrive like a storm or a sunrise. Sometimes it's just two people, both tired of pretending they don't need something they do. She says I've made her softer. I tell her she's made me braver. When I think about the night she fixed my faucet, about the envelope, the way she said, "Nobody needs to know about this," I smile now. It feels like a lifetime ago. Like we were two ghosts accidentally brushing against each other, not realizing the collision would wake us both up. Now we eat together most mornings. Sometimes we argue over coffee. Not loud, not cruel, just two stubborn hearts trying to make space for each other in rooms they built alone. And when we sit in silence, which we still do often, it no longer feels like waiting for something unsaid. It feels like being heard without speaking. I don't know where this goes. We haven't mapped it. We don't need to. All I know is she let her guard down, I stayed, and something fragile became something real. If you've ever had that moment, the quiet one, the one that feels like the world exhaled with you, tell me about it. I think we all carry stories like this, tucked somewhere safe, waiting to be told. That's your full 7-part, slow burn, emotionally grounded arc, woven to feel human, quiet, and real.